So in this video, I want us to discuss how law influences, the process of social change, either directly or indirectly. You see, social change refers to the transformation of social structures, the transformation of institutions, the transformation of relationship, the transformation of values and behaviors over time. So that law plays a central role in these processes because it is both a product of society and a tool for reshaping society. You see, law influences social change either directly by deliberately prescribing new rules and enforcing compliance, or it does it indirectly by shaping attitudes, shaping expectations, and also institutional practices over time. Now, in modern constitutional systems such as Kenya, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 explicitly positions law as an engine of social transformation, especially through its transformative Bill of Rights and national values under Article 10. So, what is the direct influence of law on social change? You see, direct influence occurs when law explicitly changes behavior through binding rules, through sanctions, and also through institutional enforcement. Now, the first direct influence of law on social change is constitutional law and legislative reform. You see, law directly transforms society by creating new legal rights and duties. An example is the Constitution of Kenya 2010. You see, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 introduced major social reforms like equality and non-discrimination, Article 27, reforms like human dignity, Article 28, reforms like socioeconomic rights, Article 43, and gender equality and representation, Article 81B. You see, these provisions legally changed, expectations of social behavior. If you look at the case of Mitu Bell Welfare Society versus Kenya Airports Authority, the first of this particular case was that residents were evicted from informal settlements. And the issue was whether the right to housing under Article 43 was enforceable. And the rule is that socio-economic rights are actually justifiable. And the application is that the Supreme Court enforced housing rights and required dignity in eviction processes. The conclusion of this case is that forced evictions without due process were considered unconstitutional. Now, the impact of this case on social change is that it improved protection of informal settlement residents. It, strengthened housing rights, and it changed, state behavior towards vulnerable groups. And this is the direct, legal transformation of social relations. The second direct influence of law on social change is criminal law as a tool of social control. You see, criminal law directly prohibits conduct and imposes punishment. And examples, includes murder laws, examples include anti-corruption laws, and also sexual offences laws. And these laws, deter harmful behavior and reshape social norms. If you look at the case of Republic versus Karisa Chengo, the facts of this particular case were that the court clarified jurisdiction and due process in criminal justice, reinforcing, structured legal control over state power. The third direct influence of law on social change is family law reform. You see, law directly changes family structures. And an example is the Marriage Act of 2014, which introduced equality in marriages. So that before women had weaker legal status, and after this act and its enactment, spouses are now equal under the law. If you look at the case of Rono versus Rono, the facts of this particular case involved, inheritance dispute discriminating against daughters. And the issue was whether daughters could inherit, property. And the rule is that there is equality and non-discrimination under the law. And the application is that court rejected, customary discrimination so that equal inheritance was enforced. You see, the social change effect of this particular case is that there was reduced gender discrimination in inheritance, and it also strengthened, women property rights. Now, I want us to look at the indirect influence of law on social change. You see, indirect influence occurs when law changes society gradually through attitudes, through values, through institutional culture, and also through symbolic authority. The first indirect influence of law on social change is law as a teacher of society. You see, law communicates what is acceptable behavior. Even without enforcement, law influences behavior by shaping norms, by signaling, values, and also educating citizens. And an example is the anti-smoking laws, they change, public attitudes towards smoking. The second indirect influence of law on social change is judicial interpretation and social transformation, in that courts indirectly shape society through interpretation. If you look at the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the facts of this particular case concerned, racial segregation in schools. And the issue was whether segregation was constitutional. And the rule is that there is equal protection under the law. And the application of this particular case was that the court declared segregation to be unconstitutional. And the conclusion of this case was that segregation, ended legally and also socially. Now, the social impact of this case is that it transformed, racial attitudes, it reduced, institutional segregation, and it reshaped, the education system. And this clearly shows indirect cultural transformation through law. The third indirect influence of law on social change is public interest litigation and awareness. You see, litigation raises awareness of rights. And an example is, environmental litigation, improves public environmental consciousness. If you look at the case of Save Lamu versus National Environmental Management Authority, the court strengthened environmental awareness and accountability. The fourth indirect influence of law on social change is that law and behavioral change over time. So that law gradually changes behavior even when initially resisted. And a good example is the laws about sick pets. Another example is anti-corruption reporting systems and also gender equality policies. Initially, these laws were actually resisted. But in this age and time, these laws have been normalized. Now, let's look at law as an instrument of social engineering. You see, this theory is strongly associated with Roscoe Pound. Now, Pound argued that law is a tool of social engineering, balancing, competing social interests to achieve order and progress. So that law therefore resolves, social conflicts, law allocates resources, law adjusts relationships, and law also promotes welfare. In fact, Kenya's legal system reflects, social engineering through devolution, which brings, services closer to the people, through human right expansion, through gender equality laws, and also through environmental regulation. If you look at the case of Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution versus Parliament of Kenya, the court emphasized, the implementation of constitutional values to transform society. Now, let's look at constitutional law as a driver of social change. You see, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is explicitly transformative. Article 10 introduces national values like human dignity, equality, social justice, and inclusiveness. These values, guide all lawmaking processes in Kenya. If you look at the case of Speaker of the Senate versus Attorney General, the courts clarified, devolution structure. And the social impact of this case was that there was decentralization of power, which increased, local governance and also redistribution of resources. And you see, this is structural, social kind of transformation. The fifth is the idea of law and gender-based social change. You see, law has played a major role in reshaping gender relations. And a good example is the case of Center for Right, Education and Awareness versus Attorney General, where the court emphasized implementation of the two-thirds gender rule principle. And the social impact of this case was that it increased women political participation, it challenged patriarchal system, and it promoted, equality norms. If you look at the case of Rono versus Rono, this case strengthened gender equality in inheritance. So, what are the limits of law in achieving social change? You see, despite its influence, law has limitations. And the first limitation of law is cultural resistance. This is deeply rooted customs, may actually resist, legal change. And an example is, gender roles in rural communities. The second limitation is weak enforcement, so that law may exist but not be implemented effectively. An example is the anti-corruption laws. The third limitation is economic inequality. You see, social change requires resources, so that without economic empowerment, legal rights are actually limited. The fourth limitation is delay in attitudinal change, so that law changes faster than culture and attitudes take longer to evolve. So what is the interaction between law and society? You see, law and society influence each other. Law influences society, and society influences law. Now, we also have reforms behavior under law, and we also have, demands reforms under society. Also, law, creates right, but society shapes legislation. Law enforces norms, but society resists or accepts norms. An example is, the public demand which led to the constitutional reform in the Kenyan, 2010, 2010 constitution. Now, the conclusion is that law, influences social change both directly and indirectly. Directly, it changes behavior through binding rules, through enforcement and institutional reforms such as constitutional rights, criminal law, and family law. Indirectly, law shapes values, norms, and attitudes through judicial interpretation, through symbolic authority, and a gradual, behavioral transformation. However, law alone is not sufficient. Its effectiveness depends on enforcement, it depends on cultural acceptance, it depends on economic conditions, and it also depends on institutional strength. So in Kenya, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 has been a major catalyst of social transformation. But you see, full social change remains a gradual process requiring both legal and societal kind of evolution. My name is Biket. If it is your first time here, make sure to follow this channel and to subscribe for more legal lessons.